Well, it's about 6:30, so if folks can grab a seat or stand if you want to stand, but if we can get started here, that'd be great. So this is a combined in-person and internet meetings. We have some folks on the internet too. That's why I'm using this microphone. So hoping you can all hear me, but this is more for the people online. So we're here to talk about the supplemental watershed plan EA assessment for the upper Rio Penasco dam sites. So kind of the agenda for tonight, there'll be some logistics we'll go over with folks here and folks online. Really talk about the project a bit, about some history of the project. We'll have some discussions about why NRCS is involved and how their program works, what will be included in the plan, talk about the purpose and need, give an overview of the scope of work, and then really get some comments from folks. So if we have a presentation you want to go through to explain things, hopefully you're gonna be thinking of questions. If you can hold those to the end or towards the end, that'd be great, because we may answer them with somebody else's presentation. But the intent is to give you some information on the study we're about to undertake. We're starting it, so we don't have a lot of work done. We're here to really solicit input and to educate you folks on what we're doing and to get input on things that you want us to consider or think about as we go through the project. So that's the overall plan.
So this will make the
turn over my colleague here, Ezra, here to give some instructions for the online folks.
Yeah, so just a few logistics. Yeah, mainly those online here. But so for those online, if you could go ahead and just mute your line, unless you've got a question. And then probably the best way for us to do questions is if you could just raise your hand. I will be monitoring the chat, and then I can make sure that we'll give you an opportunity to get your question out there. And we do have a speaker here. It's not super loud, but most of us should be able to hear you. If you just raise your hand first, and we'll go from there. And just a note, there is also the option we're using Zoom for those online. So we do have the option to turn on live captions. And so in your Zoom bar, it should look something like what's shown on the screen. You may, on the far right-hand side, there's an option for show captions. If you don't see that, click the three dots with more. And from that menu, there should be an option to turn on captions. You can select your language, make it English, and or whatever language you prefer, and then you should have an option to be able to click on show captions if that is something you would like. And we will. And for all of us, we do have this mic, like Bob mentioned. It's mainly for those online.
Turn camera off.
If you've got a question or discussion, we'll pass the mic to you. It's a little disappointing because it doesn't magnify your voice, but just pretend, and that way the people online can hear us as well.
Thank you. If you haven't seen it, there is a sign-in sheet that is somewhere over there. So if everybody can sign in, we want to get a record of who was here and get your contacts so we can keep you informed as the project goes forward. There's also on the table there some handouts you can take now or when you leave, a little fact sheet about the project. And then there is a sheet that gives contact information for ways to get questions to us after this meeting. So I want to start with introductions. You know who's here. So since I'm talking, I'm Bob Huzak. I'm with RJH Consultants. I'm the project manager, and we're the consultant that NRCS has hired to help lead them through this project. You've already met my colleague Ezra, who's also with us. And then I'll cover the consultants first. I'll let Katie introduce herself. She's part of our team, a different company, but part of our consultant team.
Hi, I'm Katie Evans with Pinion Environmental, supporting the environmental side of this planning effort.
Thanks, Katie. I'll go to NRCS next. They're the lead federal agency. And then I would like everybody else to just say who you are. If you're with a particular organization, say that. If you're a citizen or resident, your name is just fine.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Eli Ganan. I'm the state conservation engineer with NRCS, so I oversee our watershed programs.
Yeah, and I'm Mercedes Faybox. So I am the state watershed program manager. We're both based out of Albuquerque, the state office. So we cover the whole state, but I basically oversee all of our active projects across the state, which this is one of them. And I will say we also got some coffee and some water, and we've got some cookies, we got some muffins. So y'all dig in, enjoy yourselves. And yeah, appreciate you guys being here.
I'm Jeff Rabin with the Otero Soil and Water Conservation District, and we are the sponsor of these dams.
Bob Nichols with Soil and Water Conservation District Chairman. Just names. Ed Miller, resident.
Mary Miller, resident.
Kathy Miller, resident.
And Jerry Miller, the other resident.
Chris Vogel, resident.
This is Danielle and Thomas Lewis. We're with Penasco Gravel.
Dwayne Lewis, resident. Clifton Barble, Soil and Water District member.
Chad Novak, hydrologist for the Lincoln National Forest.
Matt Clark, Otero County Office of Emergency Services.
Rowan Crump, I am the Lincoln National Forest soil scientist.
Joyce Comaros, resident.
And I'm Mark Cadwallader. I've done some contract work for the soil and water and overseeing some of the maintenance work out there. So
Thanks. Now, if you can get the folks online, Ezra.
Yeah, those online, if you're able to just unmute yourself and just say your name and where you're, if you're a resident or with an agency, we should be able to hear you here.
Scott Stahl, resident.
Lorraine Vogel, resident.
Fitzgerald's residence.
Carrie Lewis, resident.
Great. Well, thank you all for participating. Hope you find this meeting informative and look forward to some good questions here towards the end for everybody. So I think everybody knows where we are, but just for those who may be further away, I call this kind of south central New Mexico. We're in the Rio Penasco valleys, where this project is looking at 3 dams going from upstream to downstream. Site 1, which is Bear Creek, Site 2, which is Curtis Canyon, and Site 3A, Graveyard Canyon. So all of these 3 are part of the original watershed plan, and all these 3 dams are being considered in the project. Doesn't mean that each one will have the same alternatives, but in general, they're all part of the project. We're looking at all three of these facilities. So if you've been out there, these are just pictures of what they generally look like. They're all earthen dams. So you got a fairly large, from 50 to 65 feet high earthen dams. They're a little different configuration, but they're all earthen dams. All of them have what's called a service or emergency spillway. So basically, if you go out there, there's an area that's cut lower on one side of the dam that lets water go around the dam, the emergency spillway, and they all have a riser. But go to the next slide, Ezra. They all have a riser structure similar to that one that lets water in and then goes through pipe under the dam to let the water out. That's referred to as a principal spillway. So these were, the original plan was these reservoirs provided flood control and sediment retention. So the way they work is they're normally dry. When a storm comes, the reservoir starts to fill, water goes into that intake vertical structure, then out the outlet pipe at a very low rate. So these dams were designed to provide flood protection for up to a 25-year storm. That's what they were designed for, and the whole sediment coming down. And so how they would work, you get a storm, let's say up to a 25-year storm, they would fill up, a small amount of water gets released on the principal conduit, but it keeps all the flood waters contained upstream, so it protects the structures, people, roads downstream. If you get a storm larger than that, then the water flows into the auxiliary spillway and flows around the dam. So it storms above about a 25-year event. then the dam is really not providing much benefit. The water is just passing around it. And that's how a dam is supposed to work. When these dams were first built, they were what's considered low hazard dams, which meant that if they were to fail when they had water, there was not the risk for loss of public life, loss of human life. It would be some minor damage. Since they've been built, people have built downstream, there's houses downstream. So if they were to fail right now, then they're considered high hazard dams. It means there's a risk for possible life loss, which changes the design criteria. So they were built in the 1959, 1960s for flood protection. Like I said, originally rated as low hazard, but they're now high hazard, which means they have to meet different standards than they had to meet back in the 60s. So two things have changed. The standards overall have changed a little bit as the engineering communities learn more, understand things a little bit better, but also the hazards, the big change that they now have to pass larger storms without failing. So flood control dams, at some storm, when the water gets high enough, it goes through the spillway. If more water comes in, it overtops the dam. When dams overtop, then they generally fail. And that's a concern. With a high hazard dam, you've got to design to a much higher storm event to provide protection, because if it fails, you release this big gush of water that is a big flood wave coming down the valley, which puts a lot of people at risk. So there was some work done in 23, and it was found that these dams don't meet some current standards, and that's why we're doing the project. There may be some other things they don't meet as we go through more detailed studies, but what initiated the project was the spillways aren't large enough. So they basically can't pass the storm events that are required without the dam overtopping and failing. The crest width isn't wide enough. That's pretty minor. There's no what's called filters. So in earth dams, water, they're not impermeable. Water does flow through. Modern design criteria puts in filters, uniformly graded sands or gravels that collect that seepage and make it drain out in a controlled manner. These dams don't have that, and that's considered a deficiency with current design standards. And there may be some other ones that we may identify as we go into more of the detailed work. So the benefits they provide, like I said, it's sediment retention. If you've been out there, you can see there's quite a bit of sediment that's accumulated out there. The sponsor has, at times, in some of these dams, removed some of that sediment to keep that volume available for flood storage. They consider to provide flood protection for minor events. And a minor event means a 1 in 25 year event storm is a fairly routine storm event. Doesn't sound like that, but it's pretty routine. Flood control projects being done today are more designed for 100 to 500 year type protection. It doesn't mean it will occur every 25 years. It means there's a 1 in 25 probability that it will occur in any 1 year. So you could have, theoretically, you could have 2 25-year storms back to back. It doesn't mean that that's how far apart they are. It's just that's how often that amount of water would likely fall. And so how we look at that, go ahead, Ezra. So how we look at the hazard is we do hydraulic modeling. So what we do is we say the dam's filled with water and more water is coming in that can be passed through the spillway, and it gets to the top of the dam crest. Water overtops that. You've probably seen erosional failures as you live around your communities, but once it overtops the dam, the downstream slope is pretty steep. That water picks up speed. It starts to erode the embankment. It erodes backwards and creates a hole through the embankment. Then all that water is rushed out. We model that and look to see what's impacted downstream. And we kind of look at two things: how deep is the water and how fast is it going? And so there's criteria for, generally with people, in general, if the product of how fast it's going and how deep it is 7 or greater, generally it knocks people off their feet, and that's considered a potential life loss. So all these stars on here are places where there's buildings or homes or an RV park where if this flood came down, there would be a risk of loss of life. So there's a pretty high risk of potential loss of life if these were to fail with water behind them, and that's why we're doing this study, to protect public safety. So it's a similar map for each dam, but each of them have quite a few homes that are within this floodway. A few less down at Graveyard, but all of them, that's why they're high hazard, because there's places where people spend time that would be at risk. I'm going to now turn it over to Mercedes, who will talk a little bit about just the watershed program and what NRCS does and some various programs that NRCS offers and kind of why they're involved in this project. Take it away.
Pleasure. All right, so hopefully y'all can hear me okay. I'm gonna try to stay over here in this area because that fridge can be kind of loud. So the whole idea behind this is, we're looking at the dam. Obviously, there's some deficiencies. They're not meeting current federal and state dam safety standards. So the idea is, how can we improve this dam? But the idea behind our watershed program is we have to look at it at a larger scale than just the dam itself. So the idea behind this slide is just to kind of give you an idea of what that extra area encompasses. So a watershed, reading right off the screen, is the land that drains to one stream, lake, or river, or in this case, a dam, and includes not only surface water, but also underlying groundwater. So some states that plays a factor, not really a high factor here in the Southwest, but other states it does apply. How do we label these watersheds is a hydrologic unit code, or as always, we like our acronyms, so we'll call it a HUC. And what that is it's basically an identification tool to figure out which watershed we're talking about. And it's universal across the country. So anybody across the country is going to know exactly what watershed we're referencing. So everything on that screen over there has a watershed of some sort. But obviously there's different components depending on where two segments come together, where there's a confluence. So the idea behind that is, okay, there's different numbers that represent different scales, different HUC boundaries. So that's kind of confusing. The smaller the number that the HUC, that unit code, the smaller the number, the larger the area it's going to contain. So in that picture over there, if you look at the largest polygon, the yellow one, we'd probably consider that a HUC 8. So it would be a hydrologic unit code with 8 numbers following it. And then we can narrow it down to maybe one of the red polygons, and we would say that's more of a HUC 12. So a hydrologic unit code with 12 numbers following it. So a little complicated, but the idea is, when it comes to a dam, we have to figure out what's actually contributing all that sediment, all that flood water, where is it coming from and how fast is it coming? And then downstream, if this thing were to breach, we have to make sure we're considering everybody downstream as well for a number of reasons that we'll explain throughout the PowerPoint. Next slide, please. So I'm going to use this opportunity as like a little outreach. So it's not just the rehab program that our department, our agency actually offers under our watershed umbrellas, like what I like to call it. We actually have 3 programs that we offer. And these are all based off of a very large scale entity. So our sponsors, like in this case, we're working with the Otero Soil and Water Conservation District, but we can work with other state, federal, and local, even recognized tribes, like the really large scale, large areas, multiple landowners is who we're working with under this watershed program. So obviously the one circled in the middle is the one we're talking about today. We just help rehab dams that NRCS built over the years just to bring them up to current design standards, or if there's some sort of other deficiencies with them, just help those sponsors out to bring them up to current code. On the left-hand side, we've got our WFPO, which is the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program. It's kind of the jack of all trades. If nothing falls under the other 2, then more than likely it'll fall under that one on the left. So that one is all-inclusive. We can do water management, ag water management. We could do municipal water supply. We can do public recreation. We could do watershed protection with that one. So a lot of stuff goes into that program over there that would help you qualify for that. And then on the far right-hand side is our EWP program. So that's our Emergency Watershed Protection Program. That normally follows a natural disaster. So a lot of fires we see in the state of New Mexico, we can help out with EWP after that, help landowners who are impacted even directly or indirectly by the fire or any post-flooding as far as that's concerned. We can help with that as well. Next slide, please. Program requirements. So obviously we're just going to focus on the one I had circled. So the rehab program, what may be included, how does this qualify? How does my dam qualify? Like I said before, it has to be an NRCS built dam. So we can't help with, say, a dam that was built by the Corps of Engineers or a dam that was built by FEMA. It has to be an NRCS built dam. But other than that, it's pretty wide open as far as what we need to consider for it to actually qualify for a program. It could be anything from, we got a letter from the Office of the State Engineer Dam Safety Bureau that says we're out of compliance. It could be something like, we don't need this dam anymore. It's not helping us out. It's not helping out the community. So we want to decommission it, basically remove it altogether. And then it could be a bunch of things in between too. Even following a catastrophic event, we just had the flooding over there in Rio Doso. Is that right, Eli? Yeah, so a couple of our dams over there got blown out from the flooding that occurred in those towns. So we're helping with that as well. So as far as cost share goes, this is the basic cost share. We don't change it. 65% federal, 35% on the sponsor, but it is only when it comes to construction. So we have 4 phases that I'll explain in the next slide, but this only applies to the last phase of the project itself. So NRCS will pay 100% of the cost share up to that construction point. And then that's where the 35% comes in. So that can be anything from the actual construction improvements to the dam, to permits, to land rights, easements, any of that stuff. That's kind of where that 35% comes into play. Next slide. And then here are the 4 steps. Obviously, we're in step number 2. So the dam assessment that we conducted was a couple years back, and that's kind of where these deficiencies came up that Bob was talking about in an earlier slide. That's kind of what we figured out in our dam assessment that we completed. We're in the rehab planning phase right now. And then once we get that done, I don't know, 18 to 24 months is what we try to shoot for. When it comes to these plans, they can be very drawn out. I know a lot of folks say we have a resource concern and we'd like, something done now. That's one of the problems with our program is how long some of these can take. So if everything goes right, you have the assessment, planning, design, and construction. That can be up to 10 years if everything goes right. But if there's also another limitation as far as funding goes, we sometimes get funding across the country. We can utilize it. Other years, we don't get any funding. So that can also play a factor in when things actually get done and we see some dirt turned on the ground. So there are a couple limitations, but I definitely know RGH is trying the best they can to get at least the planning phase done in that 18 to 24 months. That's what we're shooting for. So as far as our web page, I actually am going to be updating this on a monthly basis. So if there's, obviously 18 to 24 months, that's a long time. And so if there's any questions at all as far as project updates, that's the website that you're going to be able to find it. And I know this was included on the notice that y'all got in the mail. And there's also another little fact sheet here at the table it's as a reminder of where you can find these updates. And then I know I'm going to post the slides on this web page as well. And I think this presentation's recorded. Is that right? Okay, so I'll be posting the recording on here as well, just so that way if you need reference or if you want more information, you can always go to this website. And I think I'll hand it over to Katie. Thanks, folks.
Okay, we'll transition now to talking a bit about the main federal law that is driving this environmental review process, and we'll give you a feel for what you can expect to see in the planning document that we will produce at the end of this process. So NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, is a law that pertains to all federal agencies. It basically requires them to consider environmental effects before they make a decision on any kind of proposed action. So this applies in the case of a federal agency authorizing. You can think about a permit issuance, funding something, or actually implementing, constructing a dam, for example. So in this particular case, NRCS provided the funding for this planning project, and they will ultimately approve the plan at the end. So that's kind of the background here. We will prepare an environmental assessment, or EA, as part of the planning process, and that's the piece that will look at a whole suite of impacts ranging from environmental, social, and economic. This slide just gives you a high-level overview of what the plan EA will look like. So each of those blue rectangles is basically a section that you'll ultimately see in the plan. So we'll start out with a lot of that project background information that Bob talked through, describing the purpose and need, which Bob will go through in just a minute, but basically what's driving the project. So the plan will walk through all of that, set that background before we delve into the affected environment. So you can think of that as the existing conditions in the study area for a wide range of resources. So that green box, it's tricky to read, but I'll tell you that it includes a range of resources from soil to air quality, threatened and endangered species, land use. A whole host of things will be reviewed with respect to what's on the ground now and what could be impacted by one or more alternatives in the plan. We'll also speak to how the alternatives were developed. So what went into consideration as for an actual action, and what were some of the reasons why alternatives weren't moved forward for further evaluation. So all that rationale will be presented in the plan. And one of the larger sections will be the environmental consequences. So that is the discussion of impacts to all those resources in that green box. So going through and explaining what could happen to each of those resources with the implementation of one or more of the alternatives. And I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Katie. So the purpose and need really defines what alternatives we can look at. So it's really what was identified when the project was initially authorized back in the late 50s, early 60s. And then any changes that need to be made based on comments or discussions with the sponsors. So right now the purpose is maintain flood protection that's currently provided. So to provide flood protection and to reduce sediment deposition. So that's the main purpose of the project. So the purpose are not to have like a full pool for recreation or fishing. That's not part of the authorized purpose. So so all of our projects need to look at alternatives that would meet the authorized purposes, which are flood protection and reduce sediment deposition downstream. And then why do we need the project? We need it because we said the dam has deficiencies that don't meet current NRCS or state standards, and basically to improve public safety. Those standards are in place to maintain public safety, and that's why we're looking at this project. So our scope has 4 phases. I'll do a high-level overview here. We have some more slides to explain these, but right now we're in what's phase 1. So phase 1 is we're trying to establish the boundaries, or what are the key things the person need, what are we looking at, kind of what are our objectives we have to accomplish. We're trying to get all the background information collected. We're collecting some other data we need to evaluate it, and really focusing on the purpose and need. And then we're starting to get into looking at various resources that are out there now. So we start looking at alternatives. We know what resources we may or may not be affecting. And then alternative 3 is we formulate alternatives. We start with a very broad range of alternatives, and then we narrow those down with the intent of this phase is really getting to a preferred alternative, which there's 3 dams. So the preferred alternative could be different at each particular structure. So it's usually these projects are done with one dam. We have 3. So we're looking at alternatives for each one of those, and the preferred alternative could be different for each different canyon, not be the same. And then it's all put together into a final document. It's really the decision document that meets the NEPA criteria, meets the federal regulations. It really is the framework for why the sponsor and NRCS selected what they wanted to move forward with, and then that would be the alternative that gets carried into design if the project moves forward and ultimately would get built. So the goal here is to make sure that we've covered a broad range so that there's not an alternative we didn't think about that comes up 2 years from now, because that sets the whole process back. So what are we doing in phase 1? So we're collecting and piling data, looking what's been out there. There are some records when the dam was built. There are some maintenance records that the sponsor has pulled together. We're going to look at to get as much knowledge as we can from what exists in the record. And then we were out there. If you live near there, you probably saw a drill rig out there between December and January. We were out there drilling holes in the embankments, basically to come out to identify what's in the embankment. What are the subsurface conditions like? Because we need that to analyze stability and seepage, other things relative to the structural adequacy of the dams. So the field work's been completed. We're doing some laboratory testing right now. We also need to understand the elevations or topographic survey. So the field work's been done. We're getting new survey of the dam itself in the area of the reservoir basin because we need to come up with what's the volume of water it can hold and update that based on new data. So we're doing the surveys complete. And then a big factor of that is looking at the sediment. These dams have all collected sediment. And so this week we'll be doing some test pits in the reservoirs to really try to find the contact of where the sediment in the original ground is. And then we will compute how much sediments come in. We're to get some data from the sponsor when they cleaned it out. So the goal is when these dams were built, they had an allowance for sediment loading. They expected so much to come in. We're trying to see, okay, we had a prediction. How close is that prediction? Is it coming in faster or slower? And we'll use that then to estimate what the future life of these facilities would be if we don't do any modifications to them. And then a lot of the work is flooding evaluation. So we will do hydrologic and hydrology work to look at various storm events. There's a lot of published data that exists for what you design. Let's say what's the amount of rainfall that will come down on an average of every year, every 2 years, so we look at various storm events called the 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 year, 25, 50, 100 year events. We look at how much water falls down, how much water comes to the dam, and then we do what's called routing it through. We kind of do a hydraulic model that says, here's how that water would move through, and do it with and without the dam, so we can evaluate impacts that would occur if the dam's in place and if the dam's not in place. And we use then those to compare different alternatives. So it's that work is ongoing. And then the public participation process, we had a meeting in the afternoon today that was more tied towards other state, federal, local agencies. This one's more intended for the public to really present the project and, more importantly, to get feedback on things you have on your minds or things that we should be thinking about that you may know about as a community that we don't know about as consultants. We don't live here. We're trying to help the community. You all live here. So things that you care about, we want to hear about to make sure this project represents the values of your community. And then define or refine the purpose and need a little more specific to make sure that all the alternatives are focusing in on that, because that's what drives the process. What is the purpose and need of the project? And then Katie will talk more in detail, but we're looking at resources, environmental, economic here is more tied to economic impacts on the community, not direct construction costs. Those are looked at on the engineering side, but there's also economic impacts, let's say from flooding, let's say houses get damaged, things like that. So those would be looked at, impacts to cultural sites, and then just social impacts to the community. And then we're analyze those resources, doing both desktop and field investigations, because the project really has to compare what's technically feasible, what are the costs to build it, what are the impacts to come up with a preferred alternative. It's not just the lowest cost or the least impactful, is what is the best alternative. All those have to be weighed against each other, and that's what we do the process. Katie? You haven't figured out, I'm the engineering side, she's the environmental side.
Okay, so as Bob said a couple of slides ago, these will be more of a desktop analysis at this point in the planning process. So we'll be looking to basically to provide a baseline to evaluate the alternatives against as the planning process moves forward. We take a bit of a larger view at this point to provide some flexibility in the identification of alternatives. And in later phases, in the fourth phase, we'll go out in the field and do some ground truthing of what we identified through the desktop surveys. So that will be done both for environmental resources as well as cultural, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we'll be basically mining a variety of publicly available data for the variety of resources listed on the screen. So everything from soil, land use, water resources, protected species, and vegetation. Similarly, we'll be conducting these desktop reviews for social and economic resources. These two will be identified with publicly available data. For social resources, we'll be looking at things like population, income, poverty data, public health and safety concerns predominantly related to flooding, population centers, and transportation networks. When we consider economic conditions, we're going to be looking at some of the demographic data for the area, as well as land use, property values, especially some of those structures that Bob showed earlier on the mapping that are downstream of these dams, as well as some historical information on floods that have occurred in this area and the types of damages that have incurred. Lastly, we'll also do a desktop and literature review for cultural resources. So these will include things within the study area as well as directly adjacent to the study areas at each of the 3 dam sites. And this review will include archaeological sites, sites that may be state or nationally listed on historic registers of places, as well as tribal cultural practices and things of that nature.
And so you've heard the term study area a few times. So that may change as the project evolves. Right now, the area we're looking at impacts is basically the reservoir that would hold water, the dam itself. And then if you remember those earlier slides, we showed where the floodwaters would go. It's a downstream stream areas that will be impacted from a dam break. That's what we're starting with. Now, alternatives may lead us to look at other areas. We may look at something that there may be some work upstream of the reservoir that puts in some sedimentation collection, something like that. So as we develop alternatives, the study area may increase, but that's the study area for now. When you hear that term, that's what it means, the reservoir, the dam, and the downstream areas that are inundated. And so this is where we start with alternatives. So we have to, in the process, there's 4, I'll call them families of alternatives we look at. One is the no action alternative. And so that basically is, if there's no federal money involved, what are the impacts of that? So that basically means the dams don't meet current criteria. There's still a public safety risk. We compare alternatives against that because that's as a baseline. There'd be a damages associated with the dam failing. There's economic, social, other consequences. So the no action is basically it's no federal action, no federal dollars. If the federal government wasn't involved, the state could put restrictions or could make the sponsor do something. So that the no action means basically no federal action, but that's no work to the dam. That's one condition. The other one that's looked at is what's called decommissioning, and that basically takes the dams out of service. It basically cuts a hole through them, and it takes away the flood protection. And we look at those impacts. And one of the impacts we look at, which nobody likes, we have to look at it, is basically if there are people in the floodway, you look at those properties and you put in the impacts and the cost to basically buy out those properties so that no one's living there. So it's always one that we have to study. Nobody likes it. I've never seen that happen. It may happen, but I've never seen it happen, but it has to be looked at. So don't think by studying that someone's going to come and force you to sell your property. It just has to be looked at. But I can't think of a project where that's ever been used. Yeah, so it's part of the study process. Then there's what's called structural, which are basically ways to rehab the dam. So once we've gone through and look at all the things where it doesn't meet standards, and there's probably 6 pages of things that we have to see if it meets or not. We see what it doesn't meet, then we look at ways to rehabilitate the dam to meet that criteria. And there may be multiple ways to meet that, and we look at an array of alternatives. We kind of dismiss ones that are kind of, yeah, it's not really practical, it's going to be way too expensive. We get down to a more reasonable list. We study those in a little bit more detail, and then we look at the impacts of those to try to get to a preferred. And then there's what's called non-structural, which is a little bit misleading. It means we're not rehabilitating the dam. The non-structural usually is combined with either decommissioning and then installing some facilities downstream to provide flood protection, like building a levee or building a berm or doing something to provide similar flood protection, or maybe lowering the dam to reduce the hazard. But it's building something usually, but it's not actually making the dam meet all the high hazard standards. It's a combination, but it's called non-structural, but you're still usually building something. Usually it's flood protection or flood proofing downstream. And then through all that process, we evaluate we do cost estimates at a comparative level to see what this alternative would cost to implement. We look at the impacts to resources that Katie had mentioned. And then through all that, the sponsor, NRCS, really picks what's a preferred alternative to move forward. Like I said, it could be different at each dam. And we'll get to that later, but at that stage, and once we've gone through all that work, there would be a second meeting to present that, the work we've done, present that to the public to see if there's any other concerns or things that we should consider that we haven't. But that's really the process, is to get to, the goal of this phase is to get to a preferred alternative that NRCS and the sponsors agree is the best way to move forward, and then go to the next step in the Mercedes's plan there of getting funding for the next step of design. So out of this process comes a report that's basically called a Plan EA document that summarizes all the work that's been done. It identifies the alternatives considered, the ones that were dismissed, why they were dismissed, presents the preferred alternative, what the impact areas are for those, and then presents the preferred alternative. With that, there's work that's been done to look at property ownership and easements. If we're doing work, we don't get those at this time. We identify what might be needed in terms of if we don't have the right property, or if we're going off somebody else's property, we identify those, and that really gets flushed out usually towards the end of this process or in the next phase. So there's really 3 formal places where we solicit input from the public. There's a meeting today, which is where we give you an overview of what we're doing, and we're to get to asking some questions later on about some resources, which ones you care about, and any comments you want, any ideas you want us to consider. If, hey, I lived by this dam, and if you thought about this, we want to hear that tonight. So we're getting input from everybody here. And then once we go through the alternatives and either have or are close to getting a preferred alternative, there'll be another public meeting to explain what we've done, why we've done it, present the preferred. And then we write the document, the formal document. There's multiple reviews through the NRCS process, but once they believe it's a good quality draft report, it goes out for public review. And each of those periods have a 30-day comment period. So we're going to ask in a later slide that any comments we don't get during the meeting, we need them within 30 days. And that's basically goes to the NEPA federal law criteria. So each place here, the 30-day period to give us back formal comments. We have a little worksheet, a little exercise you want to get some input on. We got some forms here that Katie's going to talk through, but you don't have to fill them out. We'd like you to. It basically, she's going to go through these resources, and we'd like you to kind of rank whether you think it's very important to you. Yeah, I don't really care, or I don't care about this at all. It's anonymous. It helps us really evaluate what the community likes. So Katie's going to give a little brief understanding of what each one is. And if you can fill those out, either here or take them home and send them back in, it would be greatly appreciated. We have some pens here too if we need them. Because everything can't be critical. So as you go through a project, this may be very important to you, but this may not be. And we need to understand that as we start looking at evaluating impacts. It's nice to know what the community thinks and what they value. That's why we're trying to get this input from you folks.
Yeah, so as Bob said, you can do this here, you can take it home. We'll certainly look to you guys who are local here and have a better understanding of what exists within the study area. What are the problems that you're aware of? This also should include any ideas for opportunities that you may have to address some of these resource problems in the study area. So you can see that there is sort of a ranking, as Bob said on here. You can check off which of these pertain to you for these various resources. If you have the time to add a bit more information as to the why, that would be helpful for us. I thought we could quickly go through the definitions for the resources on the screen just so that everyone is starting off on the same foot, and then we can spend some time talking through this. If you have questions, if you want to raise your hand and put forward some ideas, input, we're happy to hear it. So starting at the top of the list, wetlands, these are basically areas that have some water coverage at or below the surface for some part of the year, and typically some specialized vegetation that can live within those conditions. Critical habitat is a designation for species that are covered under the Endangered Species Act. So it covers basically the essential habitat characteristics that a particular bird or mammal may need for survival. And I'll say, if you want any more information or have questions on these as I run through them, just raise your hand. Floodplains, the low-lying areas that you all, I'm sure, are familiar with along many of the water bodies around. Recreation certainly encompasses many different things, hiking, bird watching. Cultural resources, these again can range from historic sites, districts, archaeological resources. We also take into account tribal and cultural properties. Threatened and endangered species, as defined under the Endangered Species Act. The state also has state level listed species, but endangered species are at risk of becoming extinct within their specified ranges. A threatened species is getting to that point, so they have that protection as well. Fish and wildlife, so we can talk here about birds, mammals, reptiles, you name it. Forests, obviously key for our study area. We're in the Lincoln National Forest for these dams. Invasive species, these can be both plants and animals. So you're probably more familiar with invasive weeds, but it does include animals as well. Land use considers more of the human use of land. So we can have recreation, agriculture, residential, and many other categories. Migratory birds, these are species that move seasonally, typically north and south. Natural areas, these can be both land and water-based areas that are set aside for natural values. Parklands, typically at the federal or state level, so national parks, monuments can fall within that category as well. Prime and unique farmland, these are, you can just think of them as a subset of soils which have been identified because of certain characteristics that are better for agricultural production. Riparian areas are the land and vegetation that are between a water body and the upland area, so kind of that transition. Public health and safety, in the context of this project, we're talking about mostly things related to flood risk. Regional water resource plans, these typically focus on either water quantity or water quality. Certainly water sustainability is key here in this area. Scenic beauty is more or less a subjective value of landforms and other parts of nature. Scientific resources we can skip right over because they're not applicable here. Soil resources encompasses both the underlying soil as well as things like erosion. Water quality is basically whether a particular river or stream can meet a designated use. So it might be designated for recreation, potable water. They relate back to chemical and biological properties of a stream. Wild and scenic rivers, there aren't any in our study area, but these are nationally designated for specific criteria. Waters of the U.S. refer more to what's called jurisdictional waters, those waters that would be regulated under the Clean Water Act for permitting purposes. And then lastly, social issues, which are typically tied to vulnerable populations, and in the context of flooding could be, you know, access to a car to get out of a flooded area, affordable housing, things of that nature. There may also be other resources that you may know of that aren't captured on the screen. So that's why we have that placeholder on there. So that was a lot of information. So I'll pause for a minute. If you have any questions on any of those, hopefully that gives you a bit more background if you do choose to fill out this form. We can also take a break now for any folks here in the room or joining online who may want to share any particular concerns or ideas that they have for the project. And I think Bob already said this, but we're not going to keep you in here tonight until you provide your input. You have until the end of February, so you can think about this, review the project information, and provide some follow-up in the ways that are listed on the slide. And we can make sure you have a copy of the fact sheet, which has that information, so you have the mail address. And Ezra, I don't know if anyone on the online wanted to make any comments.
Hey, Julie, I see that you posted a question in the chat here. Would you be able to just share that with us? We should be able to hear you on the speaker.
It's actually her husband, Clay. No, I was just asking, when you're talking about the research you're doing, the biggest question is, we had the 100-year storm back on July 4th, 2021. And, how well did the dams hold up for that? Is that going to be used? Because that's pretty good information to know whether, we're overbuilding or underbuilding for everyone's safety.
So I think as part of the study, we do the two pieces. We look at the theoretical rainfall you would get from various storm events. We do go back, and we will go back and look at historical events in the area to see what has happened. We have not done that yet, but that's part of the process, is to really look and see if there's been, we look for any stream gauge data, any information that might be available to show us what's happened in the past, and try to compare that to how the dams performed and what that would relate to relative to a theoretical rainfall. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just glad y'all are looking at it, because it's going to be really important, I think.
Yeah, historical data is theoretical data is good. Historical data is always better, in my opinion. You can see how something performed physically. So yes, thank you for that. So a couple of folks asked, but here's the information on the screen. There's also on the table, there's a couple of handouts. One is a fact sheet that kind of summarizes things about the project, that also has some contact information on it. And then the slide before this one here is also on the table. It has, or after this one, I'm not sure which one it is, but it has contact information on it. So go ahead. Okay, and it's posted in the chat. Thank you. Go to the next slide. So really want to open it up for some discussion. So this is more just a placeholder to get some discussions going. So we're here to get information. So the question is there any other things you want us to consider while developing alternatives? We mentioned nothing that's possible, but increased flood protection, permanent pool. Is that something that people would want to see? Not sure it's possible with water. It's a tough place to get water and have a water right, but is there landowner issues? What other things that you live here have you thought about with these dams that you think that we should know about, so we can make sure that we consider that in our study and don't miss something that may not come up with a formal analysis that the local people may be aware of that we wouldn't find in the data search. So I'm really asking for anybody to offer any things we should consider or think about as we're going through the project. Yeah. So the question was in terms of a permanent pool, could that be used for recreation? Will that be considered? And we're not saying we are considering that. We're asking if that's something that the community would like us to think about. I'm not saying it's possible. It may not be possible, because one of the challenges with these dams is that the storage volume that exists is much smaller than the amount of water that comes down during most storm events. That's why we can't pass big storms. So the more that storage volume you take up with, whether it's sediment or with permanent pool, the less flood protection you provide. You want to?
So the purpose for these has always been flood control and sediment retention is really the purpose of these. And so through the rehab program, we can't actually add recreation as a purpose because it is more looking at rehabilitating the existing structures for that original purpose. The one purpose I think they typically allow is water storage or water use for like municipal water and things like that. Sometimes they allow that to be added, but the purposes are kind of limited on these rehabilitation projects, just because really the focus is that original purpose and need that goes back to the 50s and 60s. So it's limited in how many additional things we can address. But no, they were never intended for recreation.
What about fire?
As far
Fire, is that part of your consideration or your?
it hasn't been, it could be, I guess, but
There's very little places on topic, besides on private land, you can actually go and get their little nets in and get water for it.
yeah, that's a good point. That's something we could look at.
Yeah, thank you. That's something we're thinking about that. That again, we're trying to get, that could be an alternative. So there's a trade-off again. If we, let's say we do have a permanent pool, that's the allocation, that provides some benefit and risk mitigation, but it also decreases the flood protection. And so through the process, both of those would be evaluated, both the positives and the negatives, and that would be used in the final consideration. So those are good ideas that think outside the box a little bit, that there may be it may be a benefit of that, but everything has an impact, and that's what we're looking at is pros and cons. Well, thank you. Other questions, comments, ideas? I don't want to put you all on the spot. It's tough in a meeting when no one says anything, so I'm not going to do that to anybody here. So if you have something tonight, it's great. If you don't, you have the contact information, send an email, send a letter, whatever you want to do, get us the information. The sooner we get it, the better chance we can think about it in the process. If you have something, because we get it in a year, then if it's a good idea, we're taking steps backwards. And as we all know, these projects in cities take longer than we'd like them to take, but there's a lot of procedures to go through. But if the later something comes in, the more steps back we've got to take, which doesn't get us done in a timely fashion. So any questions, comments from the online folks? Any? No? Then I want to thank everybody for spending an hour of your evening with us, and hope it was informative and you got some good information out of it and said, think about it. And formally, you've got a month to, we're asking to get comments back. The NEPA process sets timelines to help get things done. So basically a month from now, February 27th, we'd like to have any of your comments back, and we will consider all the comments we received. And then we're getting into the, from the comments tonight, we learned from the agencies, we're getting into alternatives development and kind of going through the process that I explained later. And the next really meeting will be when we have the alternatives flushed out. Next slide, please. And so this schedule is a target. As Mercedes said, we got to set a schedule to have something to work towards, but a lot of things happen in these projects where, boy, it's a good idea. We should look at this a little bit more further. So these are targets. So we're trying to get alternatives evaluated, identified this spring and summer, with hopefully to have the alternatives, I'll say late summer, more than likely the next meeting, and then have draft documents kind of started to be prepared in the winter of 25, with the next public review probably in spring of 26. So a little over a year from now is our goal. And then the final report shortly after there. So just, this is one phase of a bigger project. We're in the planning phase. Don't think we're going to start turning dirt over in a year. It's not going to happen. So wish it could, but it won't. Your input's critical. It's your community. So we want to hear what matters to you folks. We're trying to help the process, but it's your community to make sure we reflect your values in this study. And there's a very long web page link, but it is on the handouts there, and there is a QR code to not make you type in all those letters. That would take forever, and I'd probably make 3 mistakes and it wouldn't work. So that's sheets here for those that are in public, and I think Ezra, you posted that, so folks online can get the contact information. So again, thank you all for your attendance and participation. Appreciate it. Have a good night.